All right, it's 9:01 a.m. in the Eastern Standard Time, and so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Drafting the Crime of Ecocide, Contours, Challenges, and Context, presented by the ABA International Law Section's International Criminal Law Committee. My name is Deniz Tamer, and I'm honored to serve as your moderator for today. The International Criminal Law Committee put together this webinar with the assumption that those joining know what ecocide is. But let me just note that broadly, it is a movement to make mass destruction of the environment a crime. An important milestone in regard to this effort is a June 2021 report created by the Independent Expert Panel for the Legal Definition of Ecocide that put forward a consensus definition of ecocide, which they hope may serve as the basis of consideration for an amendment to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. We have a lot to get to and not much time, so let me dive in by introducing our absolutely brilliant panelists. Fajar Schouten Korwa is an independent lawyer registered at the Dutch Bar and serves as the chair of the Foundation Cooperating Organizations for West Papua, whose aim is to safeguard and promote fundamental rights and freedoms of the indigenous Papuan people. She is also involved as a member of the Environmental Commission in the Congress of Nations and States, an international organization devoted to promoting freedom, security, justice, and respectful relations between nations, peoples, and states. Fajar is inspired and involved by founder Polly Higgins, who sadly passed away in 2019 in the Stop Ecocide campaign. Dr. Zoe Alizi is an independent scholar activist specializing in climate justice and human rights education, grounded in the disciplines of law and philosophy. She has served as a teaching fellow at the Global Campus of Human Rights and previously held various academic roles at the Irish Center for Human Rights. Collaborating with numerous global institutions, Dr. Alizi extends her impact beyond academia. She played a role in developing the Maastricht Principles for the Rights of Future Generations and served as a climate justice expert research evaluator for Horizon Europe. Proficient in digital spaces, she excels in cyber activism, digital advocacy, and impactful e-learning workshops. Nelson Olagadian is a legal professional and co-founding partner at Noble Crest Solicitors, a full-service law firm with offices in Abuja and Port Harcourt, Nigeria. With over 2 decades of courtroom experience, Nelson has practiced across all superior courts in Nigeria and has gained extensive expertise in various legal domains, primarily focusing on natural resources, energy, environmental, and human rights law. Nelson is currently on the verge of completing his PhD in Energy Environmental Sustainability Law and Policy at the University of Dundee, United Kingdom. Lucas Yamat is a climate change and pastoralism economist with a wide experience on Tanzanian pastoral civil society, including conservation organizations for over a decade. He is currently a sustainability researcher with the Basque Center for Climate Change, BC3, in Spain, and a finalist doctoral candidate at the University of the Basque Country. He is researching the sustainability of East African land uses with a focus on the interface between pastoralism, agriculture, and wildlife conservation economies. For our audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and I will try to incorporate them as we go along or get to them at the end. So with the stage set, let me start with you, Zoe. The first question we want to get to is a discussion. There's a lot of discussions about climate change and climate action and climate justice, and these have been continuing now for a while. How did these discussions link to ecocide? And I guess as a follow-on, let's start with that, and then we'll do the follow-ons.
So thank you for the great opportunity to discuss this important topic. Let me go to your question, since we don't have a lot of time. Now, the discussions surrounding, climate action and climate justice are strongly connected and interlinked with ecocide, with the whole concept of ecocide. Of course, when we talk about climate action, we're talking about specific, issues and things that you can actually do. When we're talking about international law, it's a different field. When we're talking about climate justice, it's also a separate field. However, in my view, as a climate justice expert, I view all these issues as part of the climate justice movement. So, for example, these movements find cohesion under the umbrella of climate justice. So I believe that they're linked, they're interconnected, that they have, support to offer to each field. And at the end of the day, climate justice as the overarching, let's say, field, where both climate action and the recognition of ecocide as an international crime is basically can flourish. So within climate action justice, within the field of climate justice, climate action and the recognition of ecocide can flourish. So I believe they're interlinked, that they have a great connections and they're interdependent to a certain extent. And they should not be viewed as separate or something that we should like distinguish. That's my view.
So in your mind, they still have the same goals, or do you feel like they just have, they're all paths that interconnect to get to the same place?
I believe they have the same goal at the end of the day, which is to protect the environment. Now, in the case of ecocide, it's about accountability, about bringing perpetrators to justice, about having laws with teeth, like we say. That's why we want criminal law to be incorporated and to be included in the climate justice field, right? But at the end of the day, I think that climate justice can, offer this umbrella under which all these concepts can flourish.
Oh, Nelson, can I bring you into the conversation and have you also react to the same question if you find climate action, climate justice, and ecocide to be intertwined?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Good to be here. So I agree implicitly with Zoe. Climate justice provides like an overarching framework to understand and interact with the challenges of environmental degradation and harm to the climate. However, in strict legal terms, the current legal framework for the regulation of climate action in international law is within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the UNFCCC. And climate justice is embedded in that process. So if you read some of the text from the UNFCCC, you would hear expressions like common but differentiated responsibility. So that speaks to this question of historical pollution or historical emission, for instance, that countries who are historically responsible for climate change must be at the forefront of action to remediate the adverse effects of climate change. Because the data shows, unfortunately, that the countries who are least responsible for climate change bear a disproportionately higher amount of the adverse effects. And so that issue is core to the climate justice movement. There are other issues around finances, for instance, like the loss and damage fund. Some of you might be aware of that and all of those. So in a sense, they are interlinked in terms of achieving the objective of environmental sustainability. But it's a question of approach, and I think that's where we differ, because in my view, both processes should not coalesce. They shouldn't come together. I believe that we need to maintain them as separate and distinct to be able to achieve the objectives we have set. Maybe I'll have time to explicate on that as we proceed.
Well, let me bring Lucas in and then I'll come back to you, Nelson.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I agree with the former or the past participant who said, actually, my fellow panelist who said that these things are interconnected in the way that I can say in a mathematical way that climate actions plus justice is equals to sustainability. But how do we enhance these actions and actually justice? It means that the law have to be something to reinforce this. So the law actually is something that enforce these actions, because actions has been said, but how these actions is linked to fairness and how these actions cannot produce negligence or unintended result to the communities or to the environment. Because here we are not talking only about the environment when we talk about climate, but we talk about the several things linked together, including the social part, the economic part, and also the environmental part. So in a way that we want to achieve sustainability in the future and now, you need actually to work on these three pillars of sustainability, and you cannot do one in expenses of the other. And if you do that, that will be some sort of criminals and injustices that lead to ecocide things. So I agree that we need to link these two together, because, well, they work together to achieve the sustainability goal in a way. So they have to be treated together, even if different outcomes. No, there's the same outcome, but different way of doing this, but they need to be linked together.
Thank you, Lucas. Nelson, did you want to respond or extrapolate just a little bit more on your earlier point?
Yeah, just to explicate my earlier points. Now, I agree that the outcome that we seek, it's the same, but these are two distinct trajectories. And that's why I'm saying that if you follow keenly the UNFCCC process, for instance, you would notice that more often than not, they end up in a political solution. So for instance, the Paris Agreement is a political compromise that was negotiated, by so many parties. And then in terms of themes, the discourse during climate conferences are around two major themes. And there is a third one. So the two major themes are climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And then the third component is climate finance, which drives these other two. And so ecocide would not really feature within those conversations as currently constituted. And that is why, to my view, rather than bog down the ecocide movement with the tedious, complex process of negotiations in the UNFCCC, let us keep it the way it is. Let it be as an amendment to the Rome Statute, the fifth international crime. Let us follow that trajectory. Ultimately, if you ask me, the offense of ecocide, if established in international law, would serve a greater purpose in achieving climate objectives than the current UNFCCC process. But that's another conversation we could have as well. But I believe that, yes, these are two separate trajectories. They coalesce in terms of conception, but in implementation, let us keep them as distinct as possible so as to achieve our end. Thank you.
I think we have a whole panel there, but yes, go ahead if you want to respond, Zoe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to add very quickly something that, of course, we should recognize that these are, different topics altogether in a way, and we should recognize the unique goals and mechanisms, right? And there is merit in considering both collective and individualized approaches in this. But yes, I totally agree with my colleagues.
Excellent. So I'm going to move on to the second question, but just as a reminder to the audience, the chat is disabled. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we will try to incorporate those questions as we go along or ask them at the end, time willing. But as the audience can hear, I think everyone has a very different experience. We talked before the panel, we all are in different places. And so I wanted to ask each of you first, if we just take a step back, you all work in different areas of the world on environmental issues. Can you tell us a little bit about the ecocide and the situations that you focus on? And I will start now, this time with you, Fajar.
Yeah, thank you, Deniz. Yes, I'm focusing on the situation in West Papua. West Papua is located as the second largest island of the world, located above Australia. And it's after 400 years of colonization by the Netherlands, it was transferred to Indonesia. And at this very current moment, there is like a humanitarian crisis, also caused by natural resources, extraction of gold and copper. The largest gold and second largest copper mine is located in West Papua, and it's exploited by Freeport McMoran, a US-based transnational company. Due to this extraction, the environment of the indigenous Papuan people is destroyed, and they're due to military involvement in this industry. People are evicted from their land, and at this very moment, there are like 60,000 internal displaced people in West Papua. Around the world, this is not very much known, and that's because of the fact that already for decades, foreign journalists are not allowed in West Papua, and also foreign NGOs are not allowed in West Papua. So at this very moment, since I think 2019, we face big problems in West Papua. Since February, a new pilot from New Zealand is taken hostage by the freedom fighters in West Papua, and it's getting worse and worse. So making ecocide a crime on the international level, as we just talked before, would be very important also for the indigenous Papuan people, in order to raise awareness at first, and for the second at the second level, how do we make sure that indigenous people also get access to the international courts. That's also, I think, a problem that we can later discuss in this panel.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing that information forward. I did not know most of it. Nelson, let me turn to you.
So I work in Nigeria, Niger Delta, even though I'm wrapping up my PhD in the UK. So it's just like Faja has explained, the ecocide situation in the Niger Delta is really under the radar. So most people don't know what is happening, but if you take your time to find out what's going on in the Niger Delta, it qualifies as ecocide. So you have incidents of gas flaring, unmitigated gas flaring, and then oil and gas extractive activities, where pollution from oil spills. Unfortunately, Nigeria does not have a specific law on ecocide at the moment. Even the regulatory framework for the environment is within a non-justiciable framework, because beyond the specific laws that create environmental agencies in Nigeria, the Constitution, specifically Section 20, provides for the protection of the environment by the federal government. However, that section is under Chapter 2 of the Constitution, which is the fundamental objective and directive principles of state policy. So they are not justiciable. You cannot take the government to court to compel them to fulfill their constitutional responsibility. So I've had to issue public interest litigation, and to do that, I had to rely on the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which Nigeria has domesticated. And that charter, Article 24, provides for the right to the environment. And so I had to ground the court's jurisdiction in that right, not in a local law. So it gives you the context in which international law can help local circumstance. But in terms of real examples of ecocide, I'll just contextualize with a simple example. So the neighboring state to where I live in Rivers State, part of the Niger Delta. The neighboring state is one of the smallest states in Nigeria. It's called Bayelsa State. It has a population of about 2.5 million people. It produces about 300,000 barrels of oil per day in a land mass of about 10,000 square kilometers. Now, a recent study, the report came out in May, that was commissioned by the government, found out that between 2006 to 2019, there were 3,500 incidents of oil spill in Bayelsa State alone. That translates to 234 oil spills per year in Bayelsa alone. And then when they do a quantification of the volume, it runs to about 11 million gallons per year of crude oil spilled into the creeks, spilled into the rivers. And this is an environment, a very fragile ecosystem where people depend on farming and fishing for sustenance. And so it tells you the level of the environmental damage. And that is why conversations around having or establishing an international crime of ecocide is very important to legal practitioners like me, because it will provide a very useful tool in my toolbox, my legal toolbox. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson. Lucas.
Yeah, thanks. I bring the context in Tanzania, but in a wider context of indigenous people, because the United Nations recognized that 80% of the global biodiversity rich area are the home for indigenous people, and these indigenous people make only 5% of the world population. But they are really affected by a lot of big corporations given land for economic or investment determinations, but they end up misusing the land by grabbing the land even next to where they have been given, and actually affected the biodiversity which are in those areas. For instance, in Tanzania, northern Tanzania, there was a trophy hunting company which was given a land in the Ngorongoro area. And there are a lot of cases reported that they are brutally hunting without obeying to the principles of hunting. And we have also to understand that in the past it has been shown scientifically that the trophy hunting has eliminated the big herbivores in the world, you know. And in East Africa, that is also happening because there is a sharp decline of wildlife numbers in those areas. And this contributed to unsustainable utilization of game or the wildlife resources. So in this context, indigenous people have been, of course, in those lands for several years and protecting nature and everything in it, but the government doesn't recognize their efforts, and they have been kicked out of their land, their home be destroyed, and also the areas after evictions of those people really get to be the worst compared to when the indigenous people were in those areas. So this kind of negligence, neglecting the role of indigenous people, for example, because the Tanzania didn't even ratify, it doesn't recognize the existence of indigenous people, though we have indigenous people in Tanzania recognized by the United Nations. But the government of Tanzania doesn't want to hear about a small category of people called indigenous people. And so since it is formation of the ILO Convention on the Indigenous and Tribal people, have never ratified that. And last year, during a big eviction in the Ngorongoro area, they have been citing that we don't recognize that this is indigenous people. And they say they are doing that for conservation determination, but it was clearly that it was that for the land to be given to trophy hunters and also carbon credits. So this kind of actions actually in the specific locations, not only in Tanzania, but also a lot of part in the world, reflected that we need that kind of ecocide law to help us criminalize these actions and also bring those people accountable. So I think in this context also we need to link this into international laws and force the countries to accept these exceptions in terms of recognizing the indigenous people who are playing a big role in conservation of nature. So I end here, but I will come back if time allows. Thanks.
Thank you, Lucas. Let me get to you, Zoe.
I think there was an hand raised from Nelson, but thank you, Deniz. So in my area of work, which is about education, human rights education and climate justice education, I am kind of a scholar activist. So I'm working for environmental issues by doing research, by teaching, by pushing, let's say, the agenda of the discussion, by providing, updated literature for influencing policymakers and educating as well at the same time policymakers. So I can talk about human rights education and climate justice education and how it connects to ecocide. And as I said previously, I view all these topics as being very much connected and interlinked. But I want to use an example. Ecocide, as I say to my students sometimes, is a law to save our planet, right? It's a very ambitious and important at the same time, let's say, project. But we face some stereotypes, some stereotypical understanding of what environmental protection is about and what a criminal law should engage with. So through education, we can start, planting the seeds of new ideas, because ecocide as well is, to a certain extent, a new idea. It's not, although it counts decades of existing as a concept. However, the recognition, as we have been witnessing it the last years, is very recent. People have started, joining, let's say, the movement for legalizing or for recognizing ecocide. So from a human rights educational perspective, because I see climate justice as a vehicle for also ensuring human rights. Human rights are part of the climate justice, let's say, field. So from a human rights educational perspective, ecocide can be seen as a violation of the right to a healthy environment, right? To a certain extent. So human rights education in the context of ecocide involves, as I said earlier, raising awareness about the environmental impact on communities, mainly vulnerable communities, for example, the Global South, right? And ecosystems. So we're talking about protecting our planet, our home, just like the word ecocide means. If you break the term ecocide, eco in Greek means home. Side means to kill, right? So to kill your home. So it's a very promising, let's say, term, concept, and as soon as it gets recognized by international criminal law, it will become a very important and strong tool to ensure justice. So there is, from a climate justice perspective, as we said, ecocide is a large-scale environmental harm, right? So it's closely linked to climate justice efforts. as we said, communities affected by ecocide may face severe consequences. As my colleague said earlier, is the equal but differentiated responsibilities. So the communities or the locations that they're least responsible for climate change are the ones feeling the worst effects of climate change. So we look at these ideas. I also look at those ideas. I work with research, with teaching and raising awareness. I collaborate with civil society organizations. Currently, I am in Greece these days. So in Greece, there is a huge gap of information, if not disinformation, that is being, spread. So I talk with people. They have a concrete idea of these topics belonging to conspiracy theories, or so there is this disinformation that, as a climate justice activist as well, at the same time, I'm called to eliminate in a way. So I use science, academic work to crush these misinformations and disinformations, to raise awareness. And let me just say that in my city, Thessaloniki, is in the north of Greece. According to research, it belongs to the Mediterranean, let's say, hotspots for climate change. So I'm sure you heard of Venice in Italy, that is considered, it's a very serious hotspot, that when the water will rise, the whole city. So we know about Venice. Thessaloniki is in the worst position, but there's no research, there's no advocacy, so I'm working to change that, to push for more information, for highlighting these issues, for bringing the public as well on board, because the climate justice field is also part of the climate justice movement. So we all have a role to play. That's my contribution to this discussion. I believe in inclusivity and not separating. Of course, we need to work in separate fields depending on the tools or mechanisms or goals, but I believe that we all have a role to play at the end of the day to protect the environment. And ecocide, it will be a great tool to have a strong law with teeth to actually hold people, corporations, even governments accountable for these severe environmental harms. So there you go.
So I think I've heard strains of the next question in each of your responses. So I'm just going to get to that, because I think we should talk about that a little bit more, which is that more governments around the world are criminalizing and codifying ecocide. And as we've discussed, there's this international movement to create an ecocide crime. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of an international versus a regional versus a national approach? And I will start with you, Fajar.
Yeah, thank you, Deniz. Yeah, well, it links to the discussion that we just had, because the people who didn't contribute to the current climate crisis suffer the most. And as Lucas already said, indigenous peoples face ecocide crimes upon their homelands. And I think there also the right of self-determination, which in my opinion is also a fundamental human right. I think it starts with that in the first place. And because of the fact that indigenous people should have more, are most of the time not involved in the processes, the decision processes about the exploitation of their lands, and don't have access to the judicial courts. Like, for instance, in Indonesia, so West Papua is now part of Indonesia, an Indonesian province. Indonesia signed the ILO convention, signed all different kinds of, and recognizes the right of free, prior, and informed consent. But in reality, most of the time, the indigenous Papuan people cannot exercise had a free, prior, and informed consent, although it's also laid down in national law because of the fact that there is corruption and everything. And yeah, like I said before, it would help to make ecocide an international crime, for raising the awareness also, and for in the situation that national legal possibilities are exhausted, that you can make the step up to the international level. So that's why I think it's so important to push forward with the process of the Stop Ecocide campaign, making it the 5th crime of the Rome Statute, in order to also to make sure that the ancestral landowners can really be involved in the process of decision making, and as Nelson also put out, also make the link to reparations or accountability as well.
Lucas, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, I just want to connect a little bit because, yes, there are some cases when corruption play a big role in the domestic system. So we need something beyond the domestic resources to be able to punish the criminals and also to bring justice in on the table. Because if you look at the Auckland report that they do all around the world, they actually see that in some cases the government and big companies collude together to kick people out of their land, not because of the interest of nature, but for the interest of individual, as for say. So I would like to say also that climate change have no borders. You cannot just say this is the climate change of Tanzania or Brazil or wherever. It is cross borders. So we need also some cross border instrument to punish those who are causing this trouble. Thanks.
Zoe?
That is very interesting. I agree with what Lucas just said. From a climate justice perspective, advocating for ecocide to be recognized as an international crime is rooted in the understanding that environmental harm often transcends national borders, like Lucas and Nelson pointed out earlier, and my colleagues. So the consequences, of course, impact vulnerable communities disproportionately, right? So at the end of the day, why do we have international criminal law? Why we ask about ecocide and we don't ask about the other serious international crimes? In my view, we need to make ecocide an international crime because it will highlight the severity. It will, we know that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, deals with the worst crimes against humanity, right? So this is why we need to put ecocide up there in a way. It will also serve a symbolic and a practical role. That's my perspective as far as why we needed an international crime. Of course, then we can have national laws, harmonize these rules into national constitutions, or a lot of countries, like we said previously, have started, codifying crimes that look or sound like ecocide in a way, right? At the end of the day, one can argue that every country around the world has laws for environmental protection. So why do we need international criminal law? Because this will add to the severity of these crimes, of these offenses. And severity, we know in criminal law, plays a role, right? Even in sentencing. And so severity in a crime is important. At the end of the day, it makes a difference if it's an international law because of the global nature of environmental issues, because of the accountability for transnational actors. There are issues about extraterritoriality, but at the end of the day, the ICC can deal with these issues. That's why we want this organized, already existing framework and infrastructure that the International Criminal Court can offer, right, to deal with the crime of ecocide. From a climate justice perspective, of course, we're talking about the protection of vulnerable communities, and these are usually in the global south currently. So we need this international perspective to deal with these injustices. As far as criminal law is concerned, important is the prevention, the preventive elements that an international crime can bring, and the deterrence. So establishing ecocide as an international crime can act as a deterrent at the end of the day, signaling that the international community takes environmental protection seriously. I can be honest with you and tell you that I have been working in this area for almost 2 decades. I started as a climate activist, and today I'm a climate justice expert in academia. I have been very much disappointed throughout these 2 last decades by the lack of action by our governments, by the hypocrisy, by the different economical interests that are stronger than what is right and what is good. So this is why we need an international crime of ecocide, to stop relying on fake political promises to protect the environment and look at these harms and see who is responsible for that. Look at accountability, because criminal law is the best tool to actually do that practically and really, not just theoretically. And at the end of the day, consistency in legal standards. International criminal law and ecocide as an international crime can offer consistency in legal standards, because having an international crime for ecocide establishes consistent legal standards that countries can then adopt, as we said, about national laws or constitutional rules. So while national laws are essential, an international crime for ecocide complements these efforts, and also, in my view, offers a map, offers a blueprint of how these rules and laws should be developed. At the end of the day, recognizing ecocide as an international crime is seen as a crucial step for a climate justice perspective, right? To address the global and often transnational nature of environmental challenges. It will provide a mechanism for holding accountable those who contribute to a large-scale environmental destruction, and reinforces the principles of justice for affected communities worldwide. But let me just close this contribution by asking, couldn't even climate change be considered a case of ecocide? Climate change is a global phenomenon. It's not just a border, determined, or it's a planetary issue. And from a climate justice perspective, we look at climate change as human-made. We don't care about the changes in the environment that will naturally occur. We care about the harms, the damages, the exploitation of nature as is being treated by humans as a bank of unlimited resources for profit. So also capitalism can have a role in this discussion. How these economic interests can align with basically prohibiting the exploitation of nature. We can talk about fisheries, fishing industry. We talk about agriculture. Can we actually say that fishing can become a case of ecocide? To a certain extent, it can. Can we talk about agriculture becoming a case of ecocide? To a certain extent, according to the definition, it can. So there are complexities involved as to how humans treat nature, and how criminal law as the international crime of ecocide can actually highlight and clear how we should view it. So that's my perspective in the discussion. I'm a strong defender and advocate for the recognition of the international crime of ecocide.
I have a question for you, a very complicated question, and I'm going to ask you to say yes or no, Zoe. I'm going to ask you, do you think having an international crime would help or hurt the conspiracy theory issues that you mentioned previously? Yes or no, because we got to get to Nelson.
Oh, I know, but I can't do yes or no. I used to practice law. It's impossible. And now I'm a philosopher. So it's fun. But I think no.
No. Okay. Nelson, I'm cutting you off. I'm so sorry.
Okay, so there is a lot to unpack from what Dr. Zoe has said. I think she has virtually covered the field on the need for ecocide as an international crime. I'll just give you a Nigerian example. So in 2005, a federal high court in Nigeria gave a decision in a fundamental rights case where the court declared that gas flaring by Shell is an illegal activity. That was in 2005. As we speak, Shell has not adjusted its processes. As we speak, gas is being flared. If I could adjust my screen a bit, you might see a flare very close to me as I speak. So what Ecocide would do for me is it gives me the platform to take the executives of Shell to account for flaring in the Niger Delta. It will give a voice to the marginalized people, to the voiceless people, to the people that are underserved. Lucas talked about indigenous peoples, and I'll just talk about the indigenous peoples framework within the normative content of international law. So most of those instruments that are legally binding for indigenous people, especially ILO Convention 169, is poorly ratified. He gave the example of Tanzania. Most countries don't ratify it. However, in 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the UN. Now, what that has done, it has, as Zoe was talking about, created some symbolic value within the normative content of international law. And most states are beginning to adopt those indigenous policies. So we know that not all the states have adopted the Rome Statute. But in terms of the significance, the symbolism, if we have an international crime of ecocide, it will have a bit of what I call a propulsive force in the normative sense, galvanizing international support around the idea, even for states that have not ratified the Rome Statute. So it is very important, it is timely. We cannot overemphasize the need for an international crime of ecocide, more so because local regulation in the environmental space, especially in the global south, has been shown to be grossly inadequate.
Thank you all. And Tim has posted the definition of ecocide that I guess is the consensus approach that came out of this 2021 report from the independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide. I'm not going to read it because it is a page long and we're running out of time. I'm going to assume that the audience will either read it as we're talking or read it afterwards if they have not already. But I'm going to start with you, Zoe, very quickly because we are running out of time. What are your thoughts about the definition? Does it work for you? How would you like to see it changed? This hasn't been adopted, and the report itself says, this is kind of a starting place, but it was put together very thoughtfully from what I understand, and just wanted your reaction to it.
Thank you, Deniz. So I have been very closely following the development of the definition for years. And I was happy to witness the recent years, the recognition of this proposed definition. We have to understand that this is it's still a proposal. It's not recognized legally as a definition of ecocide. So it's a product of interdisciplinary discussions of experts coming together and trying to find the, let's say, silver line where countries, government, politicians, civil society, people, different cultures will agree on a definition. It's a very difficult, that's my point, it's a very difficult endeavor to actually agree on a legal definition because it has to be perfect, it has to consider all the elements and everything. But I'm happy to a certain extent with how the definition has been developed. The problem I see is with the intention. So in criminal law, we know that you need a clear mens rea, like we call it. However, the definition or the creators of this proposed definition have thought about leaving it open, and just knowledge of the possibility of doing these harms to the environment is enough. However, legally speaking, there's still silences as far as the definition is concerned and the intention is concerned, because you need clear intention to basically commit ecocide in reality when we talk about a crime. However, I see the advantages very quickly, that it's about clear accountability. This definitional proposal is about deterrence, is about global consistency. So this is another advantage. And from a climate justice perspective, the protection of vulnerable communities. The disadvantages that I see with the definition is the ambiguity that it entails, the potential for misuse, because it's so open and so vague to a certain extent, the complexity of implementation, because enforcing a crime of ecocide requires international cooperation. It's not something that we go to a court and the judge decides. It does require international cooperation and agreement to just move forward. So the complexity of implementing and enforcing such a crime could pose challenges, but that's my perspective.
Thank you. Fajar?
Yes, well, it definitely helps also, this definition in order to push forward also, on the national level and even at the EU level, to criminalize ecocide. Just recently, the EU adopted the crime. It doesn't say it's ecocide, but the definition is quite similar. So in that respect, this definition really helps a lot. And even here in the Netherlands, we have now a law proposal which also has the same words and the definition, and also the ecocide. It's now in the phase before the Congress, Raad van State. I'm not sure it's not the Parliament, but the legal the legal. Now I'm out of words, but so it's getting there here in the Netherlands as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Lucas, as the non-lawyer of the group, and then I'll call on you, Nelson, but Lucas, as the non-lawyer of the group, keep us grounded. Does this definition work in practicality?
Yeah, thanks. I think environmental issue is complex, and it includes a lot of things that some people can regard as lawful, but they're not lawful, because there's a lot of things within that. So it is a complex actually term, and also the definition also need to be complex, but utilizable. It should be complex, but having a lot of inclusive things, because there's some other reading that I pass. I'm not a lawyer, but I read from the research point of view, and it appears that people still saying that the definition that ecocide have is still narrow and need to be expanded, because it is just inherited the definition of the past. But yeah, there's a complex in a way that we need to define this concept, and also the way we need to achieve the result by using this instrument as well. So we need actually to expand it enough, but also make it palatable enough to be utilizable in a way that it get us to somewhere. Yeah.
Thank you, Lucas. Nelson, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, Lucas has made the point. It's complex, really and truly. What I intend to say is actually from a strict legal perspective, but I'll just try and break it down so that it doesn't seem too complex. So the thing is this: if you look at the definition, one of the things that happened with the panel, and I thought it was the right thing to do, was to try and advance a definition for the environment. Now, that is important for purposes of prosecution, because if you look at even the constitutive legal instruments of international environmental regulation, the Stockholm Declaration and most international environmental law instruments, there is no definition of the environment. And it's deliberate because people look at what constitutes the environment from various perspectives. But in this context, they have tried to advance a definition of the environment. And I think it's commendable from the standpoint of prosecution in terms of prosecuting the offense, because in legal terms, you must be able to provide clarity for terms used to be able to secure a conviction. A second key point about the definition are the thresholds that are set for what constitutes conduct that is prohibited. So the first part of the threshold is that the conduct has a substantial likelihood to cause widespread, severe environmental harm. And then if you look at that part, that is where most of the criticism comes from, because it is overly inclusive. Zoe was talking about examples of actions that could be legal, but they cause environmental harm. And so it brings in the question of sustainable development. How do we develop in a sustainable manner? And then after that first threshold, there's a second threshold that talks about unlawful and wanton destruction. Now, that is very important for me as a legal practitioner, because when you talk about unlawful actions, if you come to the criminal law jurisprudence in Nigeria, for example, an act can only be unlawful if it is expressly provided for in the law. So it will mean that for me to prove that offense of ecocide, there must be an enabling legislation that makes the act unlawful. However, what the panel did was to provide the second limb, which says wanton. And so wanton does not require that issue of unlawfulness. So I think that they did a very fine job in trying to navigate the intricacies around providing a definition. I think it's a workable definition, maybe some contribution here and there on expanding the meanings of the components as currently constituted. Otherwise, it's a very workable definition, and it is useful for advancing the cause of establishing ecocide as an international crime.
Thank you, Nelson. And I encourage everyone to read the comments too, because they are quite extensive to the proposal. So we are at time, and that means you all avoided my extra bonus questions and I'll just give it to you as thought, but I wanted to follow up with Lucas on the carbon credit and how that might be being misused by corporations or governments in a way that is maybe not the original goal. We were going to ask about, of course, we're a blue planet. Most of us, we've talked a lot about land-based use. I know that Zoe talked about fisheries, but most of our planet is an ocean, and what are we doing about that, and how does this definition work on that? And then, of course, as we're exploring space, that's also a question. And then my bonus question that was not on the list for you all that you get to avoid is, should ecocide be a war crime? And I think we see this particularly with the Ukraine situation. You know, it's very, you know, we applaud when war has moved away from a city, but of course it means it's now the countryside that's being ruined. And so there's a lot more to talk about, but we have literally 1 minute. So I'm going to give you each 30 seconds to just say your final comments, and then I'll just wrap us up. And I will start with Fajar.
Thank you, Deniz, and thank you everyone in this panel. It was very, for me also inspiring. And I think my 30 seconds, I will say, please go to the stopecocide.org website and become an Earth protector, and read all about our campaign for making ecocide a crime. Thank you.
Thank you. Nelson?
please join the movement, call on your representative, local representative, anybody, especially those in the Global South. Global South voices need to be heard in this process so that we have a proper, well-rounded and comprehensive crime of ecocide in international law.
Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you again for this very inspiring conversation and discussion. Oh my God, 30 seconds, I feel like
stressed out.
yeah. But let me just say that in legal terms, both climate justice and preventing ecocide involve holding individuals, companies, or governments responsible for their roles in environmental harm. In climate change, like we said, we look at the human-made environmental harms. We are under a climate emergency, so the time was yesterday to recognize ecocide. It's important to have these strong laws to protect and to hold the responsibles accountable for these distractions. That being said, in my view, I want to close with this with an idea. I want to drop another idea on the discussion that we need to rethink and implement structural changes, both in legal thought and economic terms, because are essential to transition from this anthropocentric view of international law to an ecocentric understanding of law. If we manage to also do that, then ecocide will make sense even to the worst, people that attack this concept. So there you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lucas.
Thanks. I think we want to go somewhere and we need a vehicle to take us there, or we need a kind of transport. And I think ecocide law or international laws are the one that need to take us there. So something like this, we need to reinforce this commitment that they make every day, every time, even during the COP meetings, and also the pledges that the developed countries make in terms of funding. We cannot meet this if there is no enforcement, or there's no an instrument to execute this.
Thank you. Thank you all. You have inspired me. This was a wonderful conversation. I look forward to continuing it whenever we can meet somewhere in the world. I want to thank Tim and Regina behind the scenes, who always make these panels easy and fun. And of course, a big thank you to our audience who stuck with us. A little bit of committee housekeeping I was told I have to read. The ICLC is proud to announce that the ILS Council is moving forward with an update to the Rohingya report and resolution from 2019, which will be presented at the ABA House of Delegates meeting in Kentucky in February 2024. The ICLC Year in Review submission will focus on the situations in Tigray, Iran, and Myanmar. And the ICLC will be back with some new and exciting topics in 2024. With that, let me wish you all a very happy rest of your day. May the rest of your year be filled with peace, health, and kinship. And we look forward to seeing you next year. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.